Welcome back to another edition of Gen CFB. I'm Jessica Smetana. Lucy Rohden is out this week, so I brought in my good friend, Mike Golic Jr. from Golic and Gojo on the DraftKings Network to talk about the last week of college football and the upcoming week of college football. As always, we are brought to you by Cheez-It. This season, we are feeling the cheesiest with Cheez-It. Gojo, are you feeling cheesy today?
I woke up feeling cheesiest, Jess,
cheese,
as I do every day of my life. Cheese.
Me too, as always. I'm so happy to have you here. How are you doing today?
I'm good. It's been, we were just talking off air. I can't believe we're already going into week 9 right now. It's crazy to think this much of college football season's over, even though with the expanded playoff, we know we go all the way to Jan 20. So it's a wild ride that's not even really halfway over, even though it feels more than that.
It is not even halfway over, although it did feel over for a couple teams this week. And we're going to get to the bottom of what's going on this season in college football with a little game that Taylor made up called Questions That Need Answers. Gojo, we're going to ask questions. I'm specifically going to ask questions to you, and you're going to tell us the answers that we need to these questions. So let's start with what was one of the biggest games from the weekend, Georgia at Texas. Texas gets shut out of the first half. Georgia looks like by far the better team, even though Kirby Smart said we all doubted him. Gojo, questions that need answers. Who are all these people that doubted Georgia all season?
I guess he's probably someone who watched College Game Day. I didn't see what the full pick tracker looked like there, if it was all Longhorns in that or not. But listen, I know I picked Texas in this one. I know there were a lot of people that did say Texas has now come into the SEC year one and looked like the best team. And so it doesn't ever have to be much. You know these coaches are maniacs, Jess. They're all wired to look for this advantage. Everyone could have picked Georgia to win, and Kirby Smart still would have not only convinced himself, but convinced that whole team that everyone doubted them. It's the most Saban thing about him.
Yeah, it's a great motivational tactic for your team. Georgia, their stop rate, 83%. 7 sacks generated, 10 tackles for loss, 1 interception, 3 forced fumbles on Texas. It's tough to win a game when another team's defense is doing all of that stuff to you. And Texas, only 2 for 15 on third down, 1 of 5 on fourth down. Gojo, what did you think was the biggest difference in this game? Was it just Georgia's front seven? Was it Texas having a weak offensive line? You're our offensive line guru. Can you give them a grade for us?
Yeah, listen, they got pushed around a little bit up front. I will say, going back and watching it wasn't as bad as I thought, if that makes sense. Quite honestly, I thought as dominant, maybe even more dominant, was the Georgia secondary. Malachi Starks and the rest of that group gave them nowhere to go with the football. This Texas wide receiver room has a ton of talent. We know they portaled in to replace last year, but they confused Quinn Ewers pre and post snap. I thought Kirby Smart and that defensive game plan were always a step ahead of Steve Sarkisian and Quinn Ewers, who Steve Sarkisian, for my money, is the best offensive play caller in college football. And it just looked like they were drowning the entire night. So the offensive line didn't play great, but there also weren't a ton of options and places to go downfield that there usually are. Quinn Ewers usually has pretty good answers in the pass game just based on scheme design, but he's also usually a lot better, and was before the injury, at manipulating the pocket and doing things to help out that group up front. And so I think they all got physically and mentally overmatched at the beginning of this game, showed up some in the second half, but just too little too late.
Yeah, another thing that happened in the second half, obviously this very controversial moment where Texas fans threw bottles onto the field. So here is another question that needs an answer. How come Texas didn't get a delay of game penalty for the cleanup effort that had to happen after they did all of that?
Stunned. I think embarrassment from the officiating crew, because while we know it got laid out after the fact that the officials got together and decided to pick up the flag that should have never gotten dropped in the first place, that was the source of all that consternation, it looked like they got swayed by the crowd getting mad at them, and they couldn't afford for that perception to be out there. And so I'm sure, just to try and avoid any more ire in that situation, because they are human, they might have just oopsies forgot about that. So the whole situation is a mess and sets a really bad precedent. Even if the way they explained it does make some logistical sense, the way it came off looking is a nightmare for the SEC.
You could say it's a slippery slope. This is a question from Taylor, Gojo. If you have 2 quarterbacks, do you have none apply if one is a Manning? I'm not sure. Neither quarterback was going to win this game for Texas, in my opinion. But I guess, does that apply to a Manning, Gojo?
I don't think it applies to a Manning. That's a great question. I also don't think it applies to this team because in this case, they have two really good quarterbacks. They've got one of the best, if not the best quarterback room in college football. It was just one of those nights. And Quinn Ewers, I think part of this is still him coming back off the injury, maybe not quite feeling like himself. And it showed in the way that he just looked confused for a lot of the first half of that game. But I actually think in this case, they have two quarterbacks in Austin. It's just neither of them was going to beat that Georgia defense that it looks like when dialed in is the best unit on either side of the ball in college football.
Okay, you get credit for having the good question. Thank you, Taylor. Okay, here is an actual question that needs an answer because Oklahoma has looked really bad this season, especially mostly just their offense. Like I think their defense has still been really solid. They fired their offensive coordinator this weekend. So who is Texas's best win going into this game at Vanderbilt? Is it Louisiana Monroe? Is it General Booty's Louisiana Monroe team, Mike?
It certainly looks like it right now. I mean, Mississippi State played Texas A&M a little closer than most people expected this
Feisty
last
team,
weekend.
Yeah.
The Michigan defense, I think early in the season it's still a really good, talented group. They've just been so worn down by how bad the offense is. But you're right, there's not a lot of quality on the Texas schedule. And in fairness to them, they made most of those teams look inferior the way they addressed them. Oklahoma, we know, is a rivalry game and it's a little bit different, but it is going to be interesting from here on out. The Vanderbilt game suddenly becomes important.
Quality
Texas
win if they beat Vanderbilt. Yeah, it's going to be a big one this weekend against Vanderbilt. I'm not even joking. It's a quality win if they beat Vanderbilt. Let's move on to another big SEC game from this past weekend. Alabama losing at Tennessee in one of the best rivalries in college football. Questions that need answers. Gojo, how old is Ryan Williams?
Isn't he 18 now?
I think he's still 17.
Is he still 17? I was unsure.
That was like a joke
this summer.
It was a joke question, but because they say it so many times.
They do. I mean, what gets said more often, that or the playoff predictor percentage for a team getting ready to make the postseason?
I know you watched that Notre Dame Georgia Tech game. Man, that 60% stat that they kept putting on the screen was driving me crazy. But okay, here's a serious question. Jalen Milroe, the Alabama quarterback, is this just the kind of player he is? Is he just someone that's going to be inconsistent at times, make mistakes at times, turn it over at times, but then turn around and, maybe have an incredible play in the next game and make you forget about all that?
I think so. I think we've got a big enough sample size to say that, and especially now inside a Kalen DeBoer offense that's supposed to be this place where quarterbacks can have a great time. And we've seen Kalen DeBoer's had great quarterback play. Michael Penix both at IU and at Washington, Jake Haener at Fresno State. And so when you've got a guy in an offense that's supposed to be quarterback friendly, unable to take advantage of a lot of those easy throws, not even the tough stuff, but you saw clean pockets where Jalen Milroe wasn't getting it done. He just may not be the kind of guy that's going to elevate this offense, and how Alabama and Kalen DeBoer adjust to that throughout the rest of the season, kind of similar to the way Tommy Rees and them had to adjust to him towards the end of last season to get the most out of them and get them to the playoffs, is going to determine whether or not they make it into the expanded one.
Yeah, Alabama had 0 explosive plays against this Tennessee defense, which I do rate very highly. They're a very good unit. James Pierce had 1.5 sacks, 1.5 tackles for loss. At the other side of that, Alabama's defense allowed 7 explosive plays, which I think was the real big difference in this game. It was a close game, and that long pass from Nico to set up a touchdown, like that. Those explosive plays, like that's kind of the difference when you're playing, when two teams have offenses that are just not able to convert a lot of stuff. So we said last week a key for Alabama to win this game was no turnovers from Milroe. He had a lot of turnovers in this game. A lot of bad turnovers.
And you just can't afford that because, to your point, the big plays against Tennessee are just going to come. It's too much pace and space. And when you've got a quarterback that's actually a run threat, eventually they're going to hit in that offense. We saw Nico airmail a lot of balls that looked more like the Joe Milton version of the offense than the Hendon Hooker version of the offense. So they're not firing on all cylinders. I thought Bama's defense overall did a pretty good job, but you can't give them that many bites at the apple. It's just not going to work out the way Josh runs that.
Okay, let's move on to another game in the Big Ten. USC losing its 4th Big Ten game of the season to Maryland. Mike, USC has now lost 4 of these one-possession games, this one coming at Maryland, a Maryland team that got blown out last week by Northwestern. Is this sort of rock bottom for Lincoln Riley right now at USC, all bias aside?
It certainly feels like it. I think, people pointed out his record and the similarities between Clay Helton and all those things that are, a tough reflection. We know Lincoln Riley, you're always going to get blue chip quarterback play, and that answers the toughest question that any team in football can face is who's your quarterback and how well is he playing? Having that steadied definitely goes a long way, but it's all the worst fears that people had for USC going to the Big Ten, which is they'd get embarrassed in the trenches, and that's exactly where it's happened. And so I do think a shot at the pride. I mean, the USC teams I grew up watching in the early 2000s were dominant on the offensive and defensive lines. And so to watch them now be one of the teams moving into a new conference, getting thoroughly dunked on, because that area where we had heard all the headlines about how much weight they gained in the trenches in the offseason, you stole a D coordinator from your rival across the street, and it doesn't seem to have paid off in any meaningful way for you so far.
Yeah, and there's all sorts of stories being written about the recruiting deficiencies in the Southern California region, and like Lincoln Riley not visiting those schools as much as maybe some of his predecessors at USC, and not recruiting well out of California, which is something that pisses a lot of fans off, I think. Yep. Also, we've mentioned on this show before, he tends to get a little snippy sometimes in press conferences. And
well, it's a different world now than it is in the media you're dealing with at Oklahoma. You've got less insulation out here in a place that only cares so much to begin with about college sports. You got to force Los Angeles to give a damn about this. And right now, USC's not getting that done.
Yeah, but they do host Rutgers on Friday at the same time as the Dodgers-Yankees game. So that will be an interesting one to see how many people show up for Rutgers' first in-conference trip to the Coliseum. And like, all bias aside, it's been a rough year for Lincoln Riley. And I say that now knowing I have now jinxed Notre Dame into losing them to them in 100%. The final game of the season. 100%. That just happened. But it's been rough. Okay, another Big Ten game this weekend, Illinois and Michigan. Here is a question that needs an answer. When did broadcast booths stop wearing cozy little cardigans with the little names, did you see what Brad Nessler and Gary Danielson were wearing? I mean, they were doing like this 100-year anniversary of Memorial Stadium thing where they were dressed up like they were in the 1920s, and they looked so cozy. Why did we get away from that?
Jess, broadcast fashion has been one of the things I've railed against the most during my time as a broadcaster. It is criminal that we've forsaken cozy in the name of suits that people generally see on air for maybe 40 seconds of airtime for most broadcasts that aren't the aid crew. It's a complete waste of time, tailoring, and all of our money, and we need to remedy that by going back to cozy season full time. I am in full agreement there.
This is why Al and Chris on Sunday Night Football in quarter zips was the golden era of television broadcasting, in my opinion. In all honesty, this is Illinois' best season in maybe a decade. I mean, they were good in 2022, don't get me wrong, but I think 2001 they played in the Rose Bowl. I think 2007 they were really good. So I'm putting this up there with one of their better seasons in the last, we'll say, decade and a half. But Mike, do you think Illinois has an actual shot at upsetting Oregon this weekend?
No, I don't think so in particular here. I think Illinois is kind of the meat of the Big Ten bell curve, right? You get quarterback play every once in a while, though this last weekend they out-Michiganed Michigan with Luke Altmaier going 9 for 18 for 80 yards and somehow beating them by 2 touchdowns. Riddle me that one. But I think this Oregon team has kind of fixed a lot of the things that ailed them during that first 4-game stretch where we judged them pretty harshly. You turn on the tape against Ohio State, D-line is active and impressive. Derek Harmon's been one of the best interior guys in the country. Dylan Gabriel in that offense finally starting to make big plays more consistently downfield, targeting Evan Stewart a little bit more. I just don't think Illinois can keep up with that kind of firepower.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. As fun as I think it would be to see this Illini team have a big upset like that and beat Oregon. I think Oregon is, after this past weekend, Texas, Georgia, I think Oregon is looking like a very complete college football team right now. And I sort of like them up until we'll see what happens in a potential Big Ten championship game. But okay, before we move on to week 9, I do want to ask you just 2 more questions. One, is Indiana for real? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay.
Definitively yes.
I agree, yes. Curtis Rourke, I know he's going to be out for this weekend's game against Washington. College Game Day is going to be in Bloomington, which is a lot of fun. But I do think they are good. And I think beating the crap out of Nebraska should not be taken for granted. Okay, last question. This is a question that needs answered that Taylor wrote down. Is Miami's best player the ACC Command Center? Taylor, that's not very nice.
I mean, we do tend to see them a lot during Miami games. So I would say it's close. It's probably like a 1A, 1B, Cam Ward 1A, ACC Command Center 1B, which you'd think with how much the ACC Command Center's on camera, especially for that, they'd zhuzh it up a little bit more. It's such a weird, hollow setup.
It's so weird. I agree.
Sell ad space in there. Start to have product all around. Why aren't there mascots sitting at that table? Do something.
That's actually a great idea. They should totally do that. As close as the Miami Louisville game was, and the Miami Cal game was, and Miami Virginia Tech game, I think Miami is a better team than all three of those teams that they narrowly defeated. So I don't think that the Cam Ward incomplete pass was a fumble. I think that was probably the right call, but it is the kind of thing where, like, you're playing all these teams close that are not as good as you. You're bound to not get one of these calls at some point. So you better start winning in higher margins, in my opinion, if you're Miami.
I would agree, and that's more so, I think, for their high-end hopes of being a CFP team, because you're right. This is kind of, do you remember the Florida State team in 2014, the first year of the college football playoff? Do I remember the
Florida State team, or the pick play? Sorry. Don't get me started. They were winning games by one possession all season long, and we were all watching, just waiting for them to finally lose a game, and it didn't happen until the end of the season. They somehow got away with it, but sometimes good teams get away with some close ones. So,
I mean, that's a long season. You need that stuff to happen. I know that from firsthand experience. You need the ball to bounce your way, and thankfully for them, they've got a guy who's probably among the quarterbacks right now, the easy leader for the Heisman Trophy, in Cam Ward. He's staring up at Travis Hunter and Ashton Genty, but he's been a guy that's made the incredible look effortless so far this season.
That will bring us into our Week 9 preview, presented by Hampton Farms Peanuts, the official snack nut of the tailgate. Mike, we are sponsored by Peanuts, and we love them. You mentioned Ashton Genty. He plays for Boise State. They're on this weekend on Friday against UNLV. This is probably the biggest game of their season. This is two good teams. We've got Ashton Genty on one offense, and we've got this nice little go-go offense on the other side of the football. What can you tell us about this kind of offensive scheme that UNLV runs?
Yeah, so the go-go offense, Brennan Marion, their offensive coordinator, ran this in high school, ran this at a couple of stops along the way before this, and it's the kind of creativity that generally is born from high school, where you've got to figure out a bunch of smoke and mirrors to try and manufacture big shots to go along with what's kind of a pseudo triple option attack. We'll talk about Navy and Notre Dame at some point. It's very akin to what Navy's doing this year on offense, where it's got spread elements to it. You create some unique looks to try and mess with the rules on defense, all to either set up better rushing lane and opportunities, running versions of the spread option, or set up big plays that are a huge hallmark of an offense that's going to use space too. So it's been fun to see it on the FBS level, and it's been a huge key. I mean, we know UNLV, it's well documented, had the quarterback change. One quarterback decides to opt out. Hajj-Malik Williams has come in and not missed a beat, and really, I think, helped expand this passing offense even more. So it's a very good team that Boise's getting ready to face, that they also faced in the Mountain West title game last year.
Yeah, it's going to be a good one. There's been a lot of good Friday night games this season, and this one I don't think will disappoint either. Let's move on to Saturday. You mentioned Notre Dame and Navy, noon game, ranked Navy and Notre Dame at MetLife Stadium. You played against Navy like a half dozen times at Notre Dame. You've been in all the prep meetings where Notre Dame has to transition from playing their sort of like normal base defense to now we're going to defend the triple option, especially this year with Blake Horvath, who's been running it really well, has been an incredibly explosive player. Someone that, if you haven't watched a lot of Navy games, go watch some highlights because he's been really, really good. How does Notre Dame prepare for this Navy team, and do you trust Notre Dame's young but very talented linebacker group in being disciplined against this option offense?
You know, they've had a lot better time with that in the last few weeks. Early in the season, as a lot of these guys, as Kingston and so much of this group, Drake Bowen, all take over, you've seen moments where the eyes start to wander a little bit. That's even been true for Jalen Sneed, who's an older player in that group relative to the rest of those guys. They've been more dialed in lately, but this is the ultimate test. You're right, because with this offense in particular, getting ready for the triple is such a unique animal. Notre Dame got them in week 1 last year, week 0, whatever it was. Mm-hmm. So you had all this extra time in training camp where, hey, if you're Notre Dame and you knew you've got 2 service academies on there, I'm sure they devoted periods to this in training camp. I'm sure they spent time over the summer. And, you know, Al Golden and and Marcus Freeman both have experience defending this at Notre Dame, but it's still, you got to go to a completely different setup for the scout team that I was a part of and how you approach this offense and the defense in preparing for the cut blocks that come up front and in the box. Now, I will say, biggest change by far, you can't cut at the second level anymore. So for Notre Dame's receivers or for secondary DBs, they got to have a big day because they no longer have to worry about their legs getting taken out. But it's a complete 180. You've got to reteach even the scout team how to go out here and execute an offense that's foreign to them. So everybody, especially the guys on defense, though, have a lot to adjust for. And offensively, you've got to get used to the fact that your possessions, if Navy gets rolling, can be few and far between. And you've got to simultaneously try and go and execute without squeezing the wheel too tight, but also understand that making big plays, getting out early against this team in particular is at such a premium.
That is absolutely my biggest concern with this Notre Dame offense, is that if they get out to a sluggish start like they did against Georgia Tech this past weekend, going 3-and-out in the first series, and then you only get 3 more possessions in the half while Navy just sort of like slow bleeds you and marches your defense down the field, it's going to be tough to get that back, and to get that back with explosive plays, which has been in the passing game Notre Dame's biggest weakness.
And if you're this, and if you haven't watched Navy in a while, this isn't your dad's Navy team either. Drew Cronick, the offensive coordinator, was the head coach at Mercer last year, came over and has added more of a spread element. Blake can throw the rock. Like Blake Horvath, their quarterback, is fast, which I think is the most important thing for an option quarterback. He's incredibly decisive, and he's got an arm. So you've got to defend every phase against this team that's going to maybe not just bleed it out in the same wishbone that you're used to. They're going to give you more of the window dressing, and their quarterback is a playmaker.
What was that, Chris Cody?
Which family member is it, though? If it's not your dad's Navy, which family member is it?
Oh, that's probably like your weird cousin that went to arts, like a liberal arts college, and like got into some like weird experimental stuff. Because it is a little bit more like, when you think of the service academies, Air Force has always been a little bit of the freakier one, where they'll do a little bit more pre-snap stuff than Army and Navy. And so now Navy is trying to match their freak a little bit.
Thank you, Chris, for that. Yes, Taylor?
But record-wise, this is probably closer to like
your grandfather's Navy. Yeah, for sure. Well, your grandfather's Navy was overseas fighting in World War II, probably. And actually, your grandfather's Navy is the reason why Notre Dame plays Navy, because of that whole World War II thing. But let's this is a tangent that we don't need to get down. I'm as a Notre Dame fan, Terrified. Absolutely terrified. I won't try to hide it. Number 8, LSU at number 14, Texas A&M this weekend. Texas A&M's gotten a lot of these tough games on their schedule at home this year. But okay, LSU, we maybe we didn't write them off in week 1 when they lost to USC, but we maybe forgot about them for a little bit. Garrett Nussmeier has been playing really, really well, especially under pressure. According to True Media, he's been pressured on 64 of 287 dropbacks and only been sacked 1 time. That will be going against a Texas A&M pass rush that has been excellent all season long, Mike. LSU's defense on the other side of the ball, they can create a lot of havoc. I don't know if you've been watching LSU linebacker Whit Weeks the past couple weeks, but he is playing out of his mind, and they can create a lot of havoc and sack you, tackle you. He can play in coverage, force fumbles. He can do everything. So this is going to be a huge game for the SEC standings, but I'm curious who you have in this one, because I'm a little torn right now.
I would probably lean LSU. I think Garrett Nussmeier is honestly what people expected Connor Wegman to be. And, we know he got off to the rough start with Notre Dame, was hurt for a little bit, came back and has played better. But even last week against Mississippi State, threw 2 interceptions and could have easily been more with some of the balls he put out there. I think it's going to be interesting for them. You mentioned that LSU defense, that's probably the biggest surprise for me with this team. They were the focus coming into this season, struggled a little bit week 1 and have been pretty banged up at the linebacker level, lost Harold Perkins, which is why the Whit Weeks phenomenon has grown. Him, Braden Swinson, the defensive front 7 for LSU has actually gotten after opposing offensive lines, messed up opposing backfields. Like, go turn on the Ole Miss game. They won that game in the trenches, bullying an Ole Miss team that was supposed to be loaded up on both sides of the ball there. Defensively, Ole Miss showed up and showed out. That group looked awesome, but I think offensively for LSU, huge boost. Caden Durham, the running back, true freshman running back, who really has been their lead guy since week 3, over 100 yards and multiple touchdowns this last week. Them having a rushing attack and a D-line can get after people, not what most people saw and left behind in week 1, to your point, and a big reason why I think they can win this game.
You convinced me. I'm going LSU in this one. Sorry, Kyle Field. You are going to experience your Taylor shaking his head because he's just like a Kyle Field stan for some
believer.
reason.
Yes.
Okay.
I will say, if you are a Kyle Field believer, the one thing that we've seen happen a lot this college football season, home crowds at raucous stadiums drawing a lot of penalties.
They should
And
just
if you
throw
look at-
some bottles on the field anytime they don't like a call, and then we'll be good.
That's kind of where we've arrived in college football right now. If you don't like it, we need the again, no one should do that. Please don't do that. But if you are, at least have the mustard bottle as a callback so that we can remember the Ole Miss Tennessee experience like that.
Okay. Before we go, Mike, Commodores, Longhorns. Go Doors, but Texas wins.
Yeah, no, Texas is probably going to throttle these guys. Go Door. Like, it'd be awesome to see. Love Clark Lee, but I don't think this is going to work out for them.
All right, well, that was this week's edition of Jennifer College Football. Mike, thank you so much for joining. It was a blast. We'll have you back on sometime. Eat some peanuts.
Thanks, guys.
Have some Cheez-Its. Call it a day.